Years old man fall from scaffolding, sustain an injury to the forearm. That means there is an injury which is in the forearm. Forearm injury and clinical examination and X-ray shows that he has sustained a radial fracture with dislocation of distal radioulnar joint. What is the name of this injury? Here the options are galeazzi fracture, monteggia fracture, Smith fracture, Colles fracture and Barton fracture. So galeazzi, monteggia, Smith, Colles and Barton fracture, they are all the fracture classification of the radius and ulna. So the radius and ulna, they involve this galeazzi, monteggia, Smith and Colles fracture. Especially Smith, Colles and Barton fracture, they are the fracture of the distal radius, and the galeazzi and monteggia, they are the fracture of the radius and ulna, but usually in the upper part. So let's see two important fracture. One of them is monteggia, another one is the galeazzi, and the mnemonics is, here we can see this is the magar or mugar, which is the MUGR. So the mnemonics is the MUGR. M for monteggia, G for galeazzi. First of all, this is M for monteggia, M for monteggia and G for the galeazzi. So this M for monteggia, and the second one, which is the G is for the galeazzi. So let's see the fracture. First of all, the MUGR, that means the monteggia, and monteggia occurs in case of it fracture occurs in the ulna. So MU, that means ulna, monteggia ulna, that means fracture occurs in the ulna. Second one is the Z means galeazzi, R for radius, GR, that means galeazzi fracture, that means fracture in the radius. Monteggia fracture, that means the fracture in the ulna, which is MU, and GR, that means the galeazzi fracture in the radius. And second point is the when there is monteggia, that means the ulnar fracture. In case of ulnar fracture, the dislocation will be in the proximal portion. It is very, very important. In case of the ulnar fracture, dislocation always the proximal radioulnar joint, because the ulna, here we can see the broad part of the ulna, it is located in the upper part. When there is fracture in the ulna, so the broad part will be dislocated, and we know the broad part is in the upper part. So in case of the monteggia, there is fracture of the ulna and associated proximal radioulnar joint dislocation. Second one, which is the galeazzi, that means galeazzi fracture radius, and we know in case of the radius, the broad part is the distal part, the radial broad part is the distal part. So for this condition, when there is galeazzi fracture, there is fracture radius with associated distal radioulnar joint dislocation. Again, we can see this is the monteggia, it is the fracture ulna and always dislocation radial head or proximal radioulnar joint. The second one, which is the galeazzi, is fracture of the radius with dislocation of the radioulnar joint, and this joint is located in the distal part. And the galeazzi fracture, so what is the galeazzi fracture? It is the radial shaft fracture with associated dislocation of the distal radioulnar joint, and which is caused by the direct blow. So what is our answer? Our answer is the galeazzi fracture. In the galeazzi fracture, what occurs? There is the radial fracture with dislocation of the distal radioulnar joint, and in case of the monteggia, there is the MU, that means the ulnar fracture with proximal radioulnar joint dislocation or ulnar head dislocation, or the proximal radioulnar joint dislocation. On the other hand, the Smith and Colles fracture, they are the fracture of the distal radius, they are fracture of the distal radius. And when this distal radius it involves the joint or articular surface, then it is the Barton fracture. That means the Barton fracture also it is distal radius fracture, but in this condition joint involvement occurs.